There is a moment in history when a human being looks at power and stops believing in it. Not slowly, not logically, but suddenly, like waking up from a dream. For years, people obey. They follow rules. They accept suffering. They bow their heads, not because they are weak, but because they are conditioned. Conditioned to believe that power is permanent, that rulers are superior, that systems are unbreakable. But the truth is far more dangerous. Power is never permanent. It survives only as long as people believe in it. And the day belief collapses, power begins to die. This is where every revolution truly begins. Not in the streets, not in war, but inside the human mind. In late 18th century France, millions of people were living under a system that had existed for centuries. A king ruled by what was called divine right. Society was divided into rigid classes. The poor carried the burden of taxes, hunger, and survival, while the elite lived in comfort, untouched by the struggles of ordinary life. At first glance, this system seemed stable, but psychologically, it was already collapsing. Because humans can tolerate pain. They can tolerate hardship. What they cannot tolerate is unfairness. And France had become the perfect example of it. Economic crisis, rising population, food shortages, and a collapsing financial system created pressure across society. At the same time, new ideas were spreading, ideas about equality, rights, and freedom. People began to question something they had never questioned before. Why should one man rule over millions? This question is not just political, it is deeply psychological. The moment a human being begins to question authority, obedience starts to weaken. And once obedience weakens, power begins to shake. At first, nothing dramatic happens. People don't immediately revolt. They continue their daily lives. But internally, something has shifted. Respect turns into doubt. Doubt turns into quiet anger. And that anger waits for the right moment. That moment came in 1789. When ordinary people in Paris stormed a fortress prison known as the Bastille, they were not just attacking a building. They were attacking an idea, the idea that power was untouchable. And once that idea was destroyed, everything else followed. This is the first psychological law of revolution. Power collapses when people stop seeing it as legitimate. But something even more dangerous happens next. When individuals come together, they stop thinking like individuals. They become something else. A crowd. An individual fears consequences. A crowd does not. An individual hesitates. A crowd accelerates. An individual thinks. A crowd feels. And feelings, especially anger, are far more powerful than logic. In France, once people gathered in large numbers, something changed in their behavior. They were no longer workers, farmers, or citizens. They became a collective force driven by shared emotion. This is where revolutions transform from ideas into action. And this is also where they become unpredictable. Because a crowd does not just want change, it wants intensity. It wants justice, but more importantly, it wants someone to blame. That is why revolutions often turn violent. Not because people are naturally violent, but because once anger is shared, it seeks direction. It needs a target. And when leaders understand this, they can turn that emotion into power. In France, figures like Maximilien Robespierre rose during this chaos. He did not create the anger. The anger already existed. What he did was channel it. He gave people a narrative that enemies of the revolution were everywhere, that threats were constant, and that extreme action was justified. And when people believe they are fighting for justice, they can justify almost anything. During the most intense phase of the revolution, thousands were executed, often based on suspicion rather than proof. Fear did not disappear. It simply changed direction. This reveals a second psychological law of revolution. When power collapses, fear does not vanish. It transfers. Before the revolution, people feared the king. After the revolution, people feared each other. And this is where many revolutions take a dark turn. Because the same psychological force that destroys oppression can also create new forms of it. But what happened in France was not unique. Decades later, in a completely different part of the world, under a completely different culture, the same psychological patterns began to appear again. In China, the ruling Qing dynasty had been weakening for years. Military defeats, foreign influence, internal corruption, and ineffective leadership slowly eroded the system from within. By the early 20th century, the empire still existed, but its psychological foundation had already collapsed. People no longer believed in it, and once again, belief was the key. In 1911, a small uprising began, not as a massive, coordinated revolution, but as a chain reaction. One city revolted, then another and another. Within months, multiple regions rejected imperial rule. This is how revolutions actually spread. Not through perfect planning, but through psychological contagion. When people see others resisting power and surviving, it changes their perception of what is possible. Fear decreases, courage increases, and suddenly, what once seemed impossible becomes inevitable. In China, this process led to the fall of the Qing dynasty and the end of imperial rule. A republic was established, marking the beginning of a new political era. But just like in France, removing the old system did not immediately create stability. Because destroying power is easier than rebuilding it. And this leads to the third psychological law of revolution. Humans are better at breaking systems than creating them. After the fall of the old order, societies often enter a period of uncertainty. Different groups compete for control. Ideologies clash. And people, who once united against a common enemy, begin to divide. This is exactly what happened in China. Years of instability followed. Internal conflict, war, and political struggle shaped the country's future. Eventually, a new revolutionary force emerged under the leadership of Mao Zedong. Mao understood something fundamental about human psychology. He understood that revolutions are not just about changing systems, they are about controlling belief. He mobilized not just soldiers, but emotions. He spoke to the poor, the farmers, the oppressed. He gave them identity, purpose, and direction. And most importantly, he gave them a story. Because humans do not fight for systems, they fight for stories they believe in. Under Mao, the revolutionary movement grew, eventually leading to the establishment of a new political order in 1949. But even after gaining power, the psychological dynamics of revolution did not disappear. In fact, they intensified. Years later, Mao launched another movement, the Cultural Revolution, not just to change society, but to reshape thinking itself. He mobilized young people, encouraging them to challenge authority, attack tradition, and redefine values. The result was chaos, conflict, and deep social upheaval. This reveals the final and most dangerous psychological truth of revolution. Revolution is not a one-time event. It is a cycle. Humans destroy power when they feel oppressed. Then they rebuild power to create order. And over time, that power becomes oppressive again, and the cycle repeats. Because the real battlefield is not political systems. It is the human mind. Power does not collapse in a dramatic explosion. It erodes quietly, then suddenly disappears all at once. After the first wave of revolution, something unexpected always happens. The same people who once demanded freedom begin to demand order. The same voices that shouted against authority begin to search for it again. Because chaos is not something the human mind can tolerate for long. After the size of the old system in France, society did not become peaceful. It became unstable. The structures that once controlled life were gone, but nothing solid had replaced them. And when there is a vacuum of power, something always rushes in to fill it. This is not political, it is psychological. Humans are not designed to live in uncertainty. They crave structure, direction, and leadership. Even if they destroy authority, they eventually begin to rebuild it. That is how a revolution that begins with freedom often ends with control. In France, after years of violence, executions, and internal conflict, people became exhausted. The constant fear, the instability, the unpredictability of life, it drained the society. The revolution had removed the king, but it had not removed fear. It had only redistributed it. And in that exhaustion, a new kind of leader became possible, a man who did not rise from tradition, but from chaos. Napoleon Bonaparte did not appear at the beginning of the revolution. He appeared after people were tired of it. This is critical to understand. Revolutions create conditions where strong individuals can rise, not because they are chosen democratically, but because they promise something deeper than freedom. They promise stability. Napoleon understood human psychology better than most. He did not present himself as a king. He presented himself as a solution. People who had once rejected monarchy now accepted centralized power again, not because they had changed their beliefs, but because their psychological needs had changed. This reveals another law of revolution. People do not choose systems based on ideology. They choose systems based on emotional needs. When they feel oppressed, they demand freedom. When they feel unstable, they demand control. Napoleon took advantage of this shift. In 1799, he seized power and effectively ended the revolutionary period, establishing a new form of rule. And just like that, the revolution that began by destroying authority ended by creating it again. But now, something deeper had changed. The idea of power itself. Before the revolution, power came from birth. After the revolution, power came from influence, strategy, and perception. This transformation would echo far beyond France, because ideas are more powerful than armies. The idea that ordinary people could overthrow a system did not stay in France. It traveled. It spread. It entered the consciousness of the world. And decades later, in China, that same psychological pattern began to evolve in a different form. The fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911 did not happen because of one event. It happened because the system had already lost its psychological authority. The emperor was no longer seen as a symbol of strength. The government appeared weak, ineffective, and disconnected from reality. And when power appears weak, people stop fearing it. Once again, fear changed direction. Cities began to rebel. Provinces began to separate. What started as a localized uprising quickly turned into a nationwide collapse. Within months, the centuries-old imperial system disappeared. But just like France, the removal of the old system did not bring immediate stability. Because removing a structure does not automatically create a better one. China entered a long period of fragmentation, internal struggle, and competing ideologies. Different groups wanted different futures. Some wanted modernization. Some wanted nationalism. Some wanted complete transformation. And this is where revolutions reveal their most complex truth. A revolution is never a single event. It is a prolonged psychological process. It begins with dissatisfaction. It grows through shared anger. It explodes through collective action. And then it fragments into competing visions. In China, this fragmentation led to years of conflict, eventually giving rise to a new revolutionary force under Mao Zedong. Mao did not simply fight a war, he reshaped how people thought. He understood that controlling land or military was not enough. To truly control a revolution, you had to control belief. He focused on the peasants, the largest and most neglected group in society. He gave them a sense of identity, importance, and power. He transformed them from passive observers into active participants. This was not just strategy. It was psychological engineering. Because when people feel seen, valued, and empowered, they are willing to sacrifice everything. Mao used narratives, symbols, and ideology to unify millions under a shared vision. And over time, that vision became stronger than any opposition. In 1949, his movement succeeded in establishing a new political order. But what makes this moment important is not just the outcome. It is the method. Because Mao demonstrated something that applies to every revolution. Control the story, and you control the people. Humans do not act based on facts alone. They act based on meaning. If you give suffering a purpose, people can endure it. If you give struggle a narrative, people can fight through it. And this is why revolutions are not just about economics or politics. They are about storytelling. The French Revolution had its story of liberty and equality. The Chinese Revolution had its story of liberation and unity. Different words, different contexts, but the same psychological mechanism. A shared belief powerful enough to override fear. But there is always a hidden cost. Because when a single story dominates completely, it leaves no room for alternatives. And when there is no room for alternatives, control begins to resemble the very systems that were once destroyed. This is the paradox of revolution. People rise to escape control. But in doing so, they often create new forms of it, not because they intend to, but because human psychology demands structure, certainty, and direction. And those who understand this, those who understand fear, identity, and belief, are the ones who shape history, not just by leading revolutions, but by controlling what people believe those revolutions mean. Violence in a revolution is not an accident. It is a predictable outcome of human psychology under pressure. When people live under control for too long, they suppress anger. They adapt, they survive, they remain silent. But suppression does not eliminate emotion. It stores it. And over time, that stored anger becomes something far more dangerous than open resistance. It becomes pressure, and pressure, when released, does not come out gently. It explodes. This is why revolutions often begin with hope but quickly descend into violence. Because what is being released is not just a desire for change, but years, sometimes generations, of frustration, humiliation, and injustice. In France, this emotional buildup reached a point where rational thinking could no longer contain it. The execution of King Louis XVI was not just a political decision, it was a psychological event. It symbolized the complete reversal of power. The untouchable had become vulnerable. The ruler had become the victim. And once that line is crossed, there is no easy way back. Because violence changes the human mind. When people witness or participate in it, their perception of limits shifts. What once seemed unthinkable becomes acceptable. What once felt extreme becomes normal. This is how the reign of terror became possible, where thousands were executed under suspicion alone. Fear spread rapidly, not just among enemies of the revolution, but within the revolution itself. Britannica.com. And this reveals a deeper truth. Violence in revolution is not just about destroying enemies. It is about maintaining momentum. Because once a movement is built on intense emotion, it must keep feeding that emotion to survive. Calmness weakens it, stability slows it, but fear and anger keep it alive. This is why revolutionary leaders often amplify threats, even when those threats are unclear or exaggerated. Because fear unites people faster than hope. Maximilien Robespierre understood this instinctively. He framed the revolution as something constantly under danger. Enemies were everywhere, both visible and hidden. And when people believe they are surrounded by enemies, they become willing to act without hesitation. They stop questioning. They start obeying again. This is one of the most ironic outcomes of revolution. People overthrow authority to escape control, but under fear, they become even more obedient than before. The difference is that now they believe they are obeying for the right reasons. And belief makes control stronger. A similar psychological pattern can be observed in China, but with a more refined strategy. Mao Zedong did not rely only on fear. He combined fear with identity. He did not just tell people who the enemy was, he told them who they were. He created a clear division between the people and the enemies of the people. This simple division is one of the most powerful psychological tools in history, because humans naturally think in groups. We versus them, right versus wrong, justice versus injustice. When these categories are clearly defined, decision-making becomes easier. People no longer need to analyze complex situations. They simply need to choose a side. And once they choose a side, their behavior aligns with it. During the Chinese Revolutionary period, this division helped mobilize millions. It gave individuals a sense of belonging, purpose, and moral clarity. But it also had consequences. Because when someone is labeled as the enemy, they are no longer seen as fully human. And when that happens, violence becomes easier. Later, during the Cultural Revolution, this psychological mechanism intensified. Young people were encouraged to challenge authority, reject tradition, and expose enemies within their own communities. Teachers, intellectuals, even family members became targets. Britannica.com. This was not random chaos. It was controlled psychological disruption. By breaking existing structures and encouraging constant ideological struggle, Mao ensured that loyalty remained focused on the revolutionary vision. But the cost was immense. Because when a society is constantly pushed into conflict, trust begins to disappear. And without trust, even the strongest systems become fragile. This brings us to another critical psychological law. Revolutions do not just destroy systems, they reshape relationships between people. Before a revolution, trust may exist within families, communities, and institutions. After prolonged conflict, that trust weakens. People become cautious, suspicious, and defensive, because they have learned that anyone can become an enemy. This transformation is subtle but powerful. It does not appear in official records or political speeches, but it shapes how societies function long after the revolution ends. And this is why the effects of revolution are never limited to the time in which they occur. They continue quietly in the mindset of future generations. Children grow up hearing stories of struggle, sacrifice, betrayal, and survival. These stories influence how they see authority, how they respond to conflict, and how they define justice. In this way, revolution becomes more than an event. It becomes a psychological inheritance. But there is one more layer that explains why revolutions continue to happen across different cultures and time periods. It is not just about inequality or power. It is about expectation. When people expect nothing, they endure everything. But when expectations rise and reality fails to meet them, frustration intensifies. This is why revolutions often occur not at the lowest point of suffering, but when conditions begin to improve slightly. Because improvement creates awareness, and awareness creates comparison. People start to see what is possible. They begin to imagine a different life. And when that imagined life feels close but remains out of reach, the emotional reaction becomes stronger than pure deprivation. This psychological tension between expectation and reality is one of the most powerful drivers of collective action. It turns passive populations into active ones. It transforms dissatisfaction into demand. And when enough people share that demand, it becomes a force that no system can ignore. This is why revolutions are not rare events. They are recurring patterns. Different countries, different leaders, different circumstances, but the same underlying psychology. Humans seek dignity. Humans resist injustice. Humans unite under shared emotion. And humans rebuild the very structures they once destroyed, because the need for order is just as strong as the desire for freedom. And between these two forces, history continues to move. The most dangerous stage of any revolution is not the beginning. It is the moment when people believe the revolution is complete. Because that is when they stop questioning again. And the cycle quietly restarts. After years of struggle, sacrifice, violence, and transformation, societies often reach a point where a new system feels stable. There is leadership. There is order. There is direction. People begin to rebuild their lives. They return to routine. They focus on survival, progress, and normalcy. But beneath this stability, something subtle begins to grow. The same psychological patterns that created the revolution in the first place. Because human nature does not change. Power begins to concentrate again. Authority becomes structured. Systems become rigid. And over time, a gap slowly forms between those who control and those who are controlled. At first, this gap is invisible. Then it becomes noticeable, and eventually, it becomes unbearable. This is not a failure of one country or one leader. It is a recurring pattern across history. Even after the success of the Chinese Communist movement in 1949 under Mao Zedong, the need to maintain revolutionary energy did not disappear. In fact, it intensified. Mao believed that without continuous struggle, the system itself would become weak, corrupted, and distant from its original purpose. This belief led to one of the most intense social experiments in modern history. The Cultural Revolution. It was not simply about politics. It was about reshaping thought, identity, and behavior on a massive scale. Young people were mobilized. Authority was challenged. Traditions were attacked. Entire institutions were disrupted. Society was pushed into a state of continuous movement where stability itself was seen as a threat. And here, the psychology becomes even more complex. Because when people are constantly engaged in struggle, they lose the ability to step back and reflect. They react instead of think. They follow instead of question. And in that state, influence becomes extremely powerful. This is why propaganda plays such a central role in revolutions and post-revolution societies. Not because people are weak, but because the human brain is designed to seek clarity. In complex situations, it prefers simple narratives: good versus evil, right versus wrong, us versus them. Whoever controls this narrative controls perception, and whoever controls perception controls reality. This was true in France, where revolutionary leaders framed the struggle as a fight for liberty against tyranny. It was true in China, where the revolution was framed as a fight of the people against oppression and inequality. Different words, same psychological mechanism, because humans do not act on raw information. They act on meaning. If you give suffering a meaning, people endure it. If you give sacrifice a purpose, people embrace it. If you give struggle an identity, people fight for it. This is the real power behind revolutions. Not weapons, not numbers, but belief. And belief is the most powerful force in human behavior. But here is the part that most people never understand. The same psychology that makes revolutions possible also makes individuals controllable. Because when belief becomes absolute, questioning disappears. And when questioning disappears, control becomes invisible. This is why some of the most powerful systems in history were not maintained through fear alone. They were maintained through conviction. People believed in them. They defended them. They sacrificed for them. And that is far more powerful than force, because force creates resistance. Belief creates loyalty, and loyalty sustains power. This brings us to the most important insight of all. Revolutions are not just about society. They are about you, because the same patterns that drive millions of people also operate within individuals. Every person has internal systems, beliefs, wants, fears, comfort zones. At some point, those systems become limiting. And just like societies, individuals reach a breaking point, a moment where they realize that the way they are living is no longer acceptable. That moment is personal revolution. You question your beliefs. You challenge your habits. You reject old patterns. And just like in history, this process is not easy. There is resistance. There is uncertainty. There is chaos. Because change, whether in society or in an individual, always disrupts stability. But if you understand the psychology behind it, you gain an advantage. You stop fearing the process. You start controlling it. You realize that growth requires destruction. Old beliefs must collapse for new ones to emerge. Old identities must break for new identities to form. And this is where most people fail. Not because they lack intelligence, but because they fear instability. They want change without discomfort, growth without uncertainty, transformation without struggle. But that is not how psychology works. Every transformation follows the same pattern: breakdown, chaos, reconstruction. This is true for revolutions, and it is true for individuals. The difference is awareness. Most people experience these cycles unconsciously. They react to circumstances. They follow emotions. They repeat patterns. But those who understand the psychology behind it can operate differently. They can step back. They can observe. They can decide. And that decision changes everything. Because once you understand how belief, fear, identity, and emotion shape behavior, you are no longer controlled by them. You begin to control them. And that is the ultimate form of power. Not the power to rule others, but the power to understand yourself and the systems around you. Because in the end, revolutions are not just about overthrowing kings or changing governments. They are about understanding one simple truth: nothing is permanent. No system, no authority, no belief. Everything exists only as long as it is accepted. And the moment that acceptance disappears, change becomes inevitable. This is the psychology of revolutions. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. you begin to notice it everywhere. In history, in society, in people, and in yourself. And that awareness is what separates those who follow change from those who create it. The final stage of understanding revolution is the most uncomfortable one, because it forces you to see that revolutions are not just heroic stories, they are human patterns. And once you understand those patterns, you begin to see that the line between a revolutionary and a ruler is thinner than it appears. After the chaos, after the violence, after the rebuilding, something always remains. Memory. Not just historical memory, but emotional memory. Fear that was experienced does not disappear. It gets stored. It shapes behavior long after the events are over. People who lived through revolutions carry a different mindset. They become more cautious, more observant, more aware of how quickly systems can collapse. And that awareness creates a different kind of society. One that values stability more than idealism. This is exactly what happened after the most intense revolutionary phase in China. After years of chaos during the Cultural Revolution, society was exhausted. Institutions were damaged, trust was weakened, and millions had experienced persecution, conflict, or instability. And when that level of disruption reaches its peak, something predictable happens. People no longer want change. They want peace. This is the hidden ending of most revolutions. Not victory, not perfection, but exhaustion. Because the human mind cannot remain in a constant state of conflict. It eventually seeks balance. It looks for something stable, something predictable, something safe. And this is where a new form of power becomes possible. Not power based on fear alone. Not power based on pure ideology, but power based on control combined with stability. After Mao's era, China began shifting toward a more structured and controlled system, learning from the chaos that had occurred. The lesson was clear. Unlimited disruption destroys not just enemies, but the entire system itself. And this lesson is not limited to China. It applies everywhere. Even in the French Revolution, after years of instability, violence, and political struggle, the system eventually moved towards centralized authority under Napoleon. The revolutionary energy that once fueled destruction transformed into a desire for order. Because in the end, humans do not want endless revolution. They want a system that works. This leads to the final psychological law. Revolution is driven by emotion. But stability is sustained by structure. Emotion can break systems, but it cannot maintain them. Only systems, rules, and controlled power can do that. And this is where the deepest understanding emerges. The goal of revolution is not destruction. It is transformation. But transformation without control leads to chaos, and control without awareness leads to oppression. The balance between these two is what defines the future of any society. And the same applies to individuals. Because, if you look closely, everything you have learned about revolutions is actually a mirror. You have beliefs that guide your actions. You have fears that limit your decisions. You have habits that create your structure. And at times, those systems stop serving you. They become outdated. They become restrictive. They become invisible prisons. That is when your personal revolution begins. But here is the difference between those who succeed and those who fail. Most people break their old systems but fail to build new ones. They destroy habits but do not replace them. They reject beliefs but do not create stronger ones. They escape structure but do not rebuild discipline. And as a result, they fall into chaos. This is exactly what happens in failed revolutions. And this is why understanding psychology is more powerful than understanding history alone. Because history shows you what happened. Psychology shows you why it happened. And once you understand why, you gain control. You stop reacting blindly. You start acting deliberately. You realize that every system, whether in society or in your life, is built on three things: belief, emotion, structure. Change any one of them, and the system begins to shift. Change all three, and transformation becomes inevitable. This is the real power behind revolutions, not the events, not the leaders, but the underlying patterns. And once you see those patterns, you begin to operate differently. You become aware of influence. You recognize manipulation. You understand momentum. You no longer get carried by the crowd. You observe it. You no longer get controlled by fear. You analyze it. And that awareness changes your position completely. Because most people live inside systems without understanding them. But those who understand systems can shape them. And that is the final distinction. There are those who experience history, and there are those who create it. Revolutions are not just moments in the past. They are ongoing processes. They exist wherever there is imbalance. They emerge wherever there is suppressed tension. They grow wherever belief begins to crack. And they will continue again and again as long as human nature remains the same. Because at the core of every revolution, whether in France, China, or anywhere else, there is one simple truth: humans are not designed to remain controlled forever. At some point, they will question. At some point, they will resist. At some point, they will rise. And when they do, the cycle begins again. Not because history repeats itself exactly, but because human psychology does. And once you truly understand that, you are no longer just reading history. You are reading the blueprint of power itself. What most people miss is this: revolutions don't end when the streets become quiet. They end when the mind becomes tired. And that exhaustion creates a new kind of human being. Not the one who dreams. Not the one who rebels, but the one who observes. After everything that happened in France and China, after the sign of kings and emperors, after the rise of leaders like Napoleon Bonaparte and Mao Zedong, one pattern became undeniable. Those who truly shape history are not always the loudest. They are the ones who understand timing. Because revolution is not just about emotion. It is about when to act, when to wait, and when to control the direction of change. Napoleon did not start the French Revolution. He watched it. He learned from it. He waited until the system weakened itself. And then he moved at the exact moment when people were desperate for stability. Mao did something similar, but in a longer, more strategic way. During the struggles following the Chinese Revolution, he did not rush to dominate immediately. He built influence slowly, shaped ideology carefully, and expanded control step by step. This introduces a deeper level of psychological mastery. There are three types of people in every revolution: the ones who suffer, the ones who react, and the ones who understand. Most people fall into the first two categories. They either endure the system or they fight against it. But the third group operates differently. They observe patterns. They study behavior. They understand emotion. And because of that, they are not controlled by the chaos. They use it. This is what separates a participant from a strategist. Because chaos, for most people, is overwhelming. But for a strategist, chaos is an opportunity. When systems break, new positions become available. When authority weakens, influence becomes accessible. When people are uncertain, they become easier to guide. This is not about manipulation in a negative sense. It is about awareness. Because whether you realize it or not, someone is always shaping perception. In revolutions, it is leaders and ideologies. In modern society, it is media, narratives, and influence systems. The structure has changed, but the psychology remains identical. Today, revolutions do not always look like crowds in the streets. They look like shifts in opinion. They look like movements online. They look like sudden changes in belief across millions of people. And just like before, they follow the same pattern: a growing dissatisfaction, a shared narrative, a rapid spread of emotion, and a tipping point where change becomes unstoppable. The only difference is speed. What took years during the French and Chinese revolutions can now happen in months, sometimes even days. Because information travels faster, and emotion travels even faster than information. This is why understanding the psychology of revolution is no longer just about history. It is about survival in a world where perception changes rapidly. If you do not understand how belief is formed, you will follow it. If you do not understand how fear spreads, you will absorb it. If you do not understand how narratives are built, you will be shaped by them. But if you do understand these things, something shifts. You stop reacting automatically. You start analyzing. You begin to ask different questions. Why is this idea spreading? Who benefits from this belief? What emotion is being triggered? And once you ask those questions, you move from being inside the system to seeing the system. That shift is everything, because awareness creates distance, and distance creates control. This is the final transformation. At the beginning of this journey, revolutions seemed like events, something that happened in France, something that happened in China. But now you see them differently. You see them as patterns, patterns of belief, patterns of fear, patterns of power. And once you understand patterns, you can predict outcomes. You can see when a system is becoming unstable. You can sense when belief is weakening. You can recognize when change is approaching. And more importantly, you can decide your position. Will you resist blindly? Will you follow emotionally? Or will you understand and act strategically? Because in every era, the majority reacts, but a small minority understands. And that minority shapes direction. This is not about becoming a revolutionary in the traditional sense. It is about becoming aware of how revolutions actually work, so that you are never controlled by forces you do not understand. Because the greatest power is not in overthrowing systems. It is in understanding them so deeply that you are never trapped by them. And once you reach that level of clarity, something changes permanently. You stop seeing the world as fixed. You start seeing it as fluid, not controlled by permanent structures, but by shifting beliefs. And in that realization, you gain something that most people never do: freedom. Not the kind that comes from destroying systems, but the kind that comes from understanding them. Because when you understand the psychology behind power, fear, and belief, you are no longer just a part of history. You become someone who can read it, predict it, and, when necessary, influence it. And that is where true power begins. At this point, the story of revolution stops feeling like history and starts feeling like a mirror. Because once you see the pattern clearly, you begin to notice something unsettling. The same cycle is not only in France, not only in China, not only in the past. It is in every human system that grows, stabilizes, and then slowly begins to fracture under its own weight. Power rises when people accept it. Power stabilizes when systems organize it. Power decays when belief weakens. And when belief weakens, everything that once felt permanent becomes negotiable. This is the hidden rhythm underneath political history. In the French case, the old monarchy collapsed not only because of economic crisis, but because legitimacy itself eroded. People stopped believing that authority was natural or divine. Once that psychological foundation broke, the entire structure above it became vulnerable. What followed was not just rebellion, but a full reconstruction of meaning. Then came figures like Napoleon Bonaparte, who did not simply inherit chaos, but organized it into a new form of centralized control. Stability returned, but it was no longer the same kind of stability that existed before the revolution. It was built on a new psychological understanding of power, that legitimacy must be earned through performance, not inherited by birth. In China, a similar arc unfolded in a different cultural and historical environment. The collapse of imperial authority during the early 20th century did not only reflect military or political weakness. It reflected a deeper erosion of symbolic power. The emperor no longer functioned as an unquestioned center of meaning. Once that symbolic core dissolved, fragmentation became inevitable. The revolutionary movements that followed did not emerge from a vacuum. They emerged from a population searching for coherence after the collapse of an older worldview. Leaders like Mao Zedong did not simply lead armies. They constructed meaning systems that could unify fragmented psychological states into collective direction. And this is where the deeper parallel becomes visible. Revolutions are not primarily about destruction. They are about reorganization of belief. When old beliefs lose credibility, humans do not stop believing. They shift what they believe in. That shift is the true engine of historical change. This is why revolutions so often produce unexpected outcomes. People imagine they are moving from oppression to freedom. But what actually happens is a transition from one structure of meaning to another. The form changes, but the psychological need for structure remains constant. This is also why revolutions frequently cycle into new forms of authority. Once instability becomes overwhelming, societies naturally reorganize around stability again. The human mind prioritizes predictability over abstraction, especially after prolonged uncertainty. So even movements that begin with radical ideals often evolve into systems that reintroduce hierarchy, discipline, and centralized control. Not because leaders betray ideals in a simple sense, but because large populations require structure to function at scale. This is the central tension of all revolutions. Freedom increases uncertainty. Uncertainty increases anxiety. Anxiety increases demand for order. Order gradually recreates authority. The cycle is psychological before it is political. What makes the French and Chinese revolutions especially significant is not that they are exceptions, but that they are archetypes. They reveal the same underlying mechanism operating across different civilizations. A breakdown in legitimacy, a surge in collective emotion, a restructuring of authority, a return to stability with a new form of control. Once this pattern is understood, it becomes impossible to see revolutions as isolated events. They become expressions of a deeper human system that operates wherever large groups of people coordinate belief, identity, and power. And this is where the meaning of the entire journey shifts again. Because if revolutions are driven by psychological forces rather than purely political ones, then the most important battleground is not the street, not the government, not even the economy. It is perception. What people believe is real. What people believe is just. What people believe is possible. These beliefs determine whether systems remain stable or begin to fracture. This is why propaganda, ideology, education, and narrative have always played such central roles in revolutionary and post-revolutionary societies. They are not secondary tools. They are the infrastructure through which collective reality is constructed. When belief is unified, systems feel stable. When belief fragments, systems become vulnerable. This is also why small changes in perception can sometimes produce large historical consequences. A shift in trust, a collapse in confidence, a rise in shared anger or hope can move entire populations faster than formal institutions can respond. Revolutions, in this sense, are not events that begin suddenly. They are accumulations of invisible psychological shifts that eventually reach a visible threshold. By the time the streets respond, the mind has already changed. And once the mind changes at scale, history follows. This is the final insight that connects France and China, and every other major revolution that followed. They are not anomalies. They are expressions of a repeating human equation. Belief creates order. Order creates pressure. Pressure breaks belief. And broken belief creates change. The cycle does not end because it is not external. It is embedded in the way humans organize meaning in groups. And understanding that is not just historical knowledge. It is a form of awareness about how collective reality is built, maintained, and transformed. That is the true psychology of revolutions. There is a point in every revolution where history stops feeling like history and starts feeling like a psychological experiment on human nature. At first, everything appears to be about politics, kings, emperors, parties, and ideologies. But as you go deeper, you begin to see something more uncomfortable. The real force behind every transformation is not the system itself, but the emotional state of the people living inside it. When emotional states shift at scale, systems become unstable. When systems become unstable, authority weakens. And when authority weakens, reality itself becomes negotiable. This is why the French Revolution and the Chinese revolutionary transformations feel so different on the surface, yet behave so similarly underneath. One happened in a Europe shaped by Enlightenment philosophy and collapsing monarchy. The other unfolded in a vast Asian empire struggling with internal fragmentation, foreign pressure, and ideological reinvention. Yet both followed the same psychological sequence of collapse, mobilization, violence, restructuring, and stabilization. Modern comparative studies of revolutions consistently show that despite cultural differences, large-scale revolutions tend to follow recurring structural patterns driven by social tension, legitimacy, breakdown, and mass mobilization rather than unique local causes alone. Once you accept this, the narrative changes completely. You stop asking what happened in France or China as isolated stories. You start asking why human beings, regardless of geography or time, repeatedly generate the same cycles of upheaval. The answer begins with a simple psychological tension, the gap between expectation and reality. A society can tolerate suffering for a long time if that suffering feels normal, stable, and justified. But the moment people are exposed to an alternative possibility of life, their tolerance changes. They begin to compare. They begin to evaluate. And comparison is where dissatisfaction is born. This is why revolutions are rarely triggered at the absolute lowest point of conditions. They are more often triggered when conditions are improving slightly, but expectations are rising faster than reality can match. In that space between progress and limitation, frustration becomes more intense than in pure deprivation. In late 18th century France, this gap widened dramatically. The social structure was rigid, but intellectual life was changing rapidly. Enlightenment ideas were spreading through salons, pamphlets, and philosophical writings, challenging the assumption that hierarchy was natural or divinely ordained. This created a psychological contradiction inside society. People lived under one reality, but imagined another. And when imagination becomes stronger than acceptance, obedience begins to weaken. Obedience is not mechanical. It is emotional. It depends on belief in legitimacy. Once legitimacy is questioned, authority loses its invisible foundation. That is why revolutions do not begin with violence. They begin with doubt. Doubt spreads quietly. It appears in conversations, in intellectual debates, in small acts of refusal. People start asking why. Why this system? Why this inequality? Why this authority? These questions seem harmless individually, but collectively, they erode the psychological structure that holds a society together. By the time physical confrontation appears, the psychological revolution has already happened. The storming of the Bastille was not the beginning of the French Revolution. It was the moment when an already shifting psychological landscape became visible in physical form. What collapsed in that moment was not just a building, but the belief that power was untouchable. And once that belief breaks, everything becomes possible. This is where crowd psychology enters the equation. Individual human beings behave differently when isolated than when embedded in a collective emotional environment. In crowds, identity becomes diluted, personal responsibility becomes distributed, and emotional intensity becomes amplified. This is why revolutions feel like sudden explosions, even when they are the result of long-term accumulation. The crowd is not the cause of emotion. It is the amplifier of emotion that already exists. Once collective identity forms, a new psychological entity emerges. It is no longer a group of individuals making decisions. It is a shared emotional system, reacting as one. At this stage, persuasion becomes easier and violence becomes more likely, not because individuals lose morality, but because moral responsibility becomes psychologically diffused. Leadership then emerges as the organizing force of this emotional energy. In France, figures like Robespierre did not create revolutionary anger. They structured it. They gave it language, direction, and justification. In doing so, they transformed raw emotional chaos into political action. But they also intensified its destructive potential because structured fear is more efficient than unstructured fear. The same pattern reappears in China, but at a different scale and with different tools. Mao's revolutionary strategy was not only military or political. It was deeply psychological. It relied on identity formation, ideological clarity, and emotional mobilization of the majority population. Where French revolutionary dynamics relied heavily on urban political intensity, Chinese revolutionary dynamics increasingly relied on rural mass mobilization and ideological integration. Yet the underlying psychological mechanism remained consistent. Collective belief structured through narrative becomes a force capable of overriding existing authority systems. Comparative historical analysis of these revolutions shows that, despite differences in ideology and outcome, both cases reflect transitions where legitimacy collapses, mass participation increases, and new authority structures emerge to stabilize post-revolutionary chaos. But what is often missed in most historical accounts is what happens after stabilization. Because stabilization is not the end of revolution. It is its transformation. Once a new system is established, emotional intensity does not disappear immediately. It slowly decays, replaced by routine, bureaucracy, and institutional structure. Over time, however, the same psychological conditions that produced the original revolution begin to re-emerge in modified form. New inequalities form. New legitimacy questions arise. New narratives challenge the existing order. And slowly, the cycle begins again. This cyclical nature is not a flaw of specific governments. It is embedded in human cognitive and social behavior. Humans require meaning. They require hierarchy. They require identity. But they also resist excessive constraint. These needs exist in tension with each other, and revolutions are one of the extreme expressions of that tension. That is why revolutions are both destructive and creative. They destroy old systems of meaning, but they also create new ones. They erase old hierarchies, but they also rebuild them in different forms. They free populations from one structure while placing them inside another. At the center of this entire process is perception, not economics alone, not politics alone, not even ideology alone. Perception determines whether authority is seen as legitimate or illegitimate, and legitimacy is the true foundation of power. Once legitimacy collapses, physical force becomes secondary. A system may still exist structurally, but psychologically it has already ended. This is why revolutions are ultimately battles over belief systems rather than physical territory. The side that controls perception controls direction. And that is why understanding revolutions is not just about studying past events. It is about understanding how collective belief is constructed, maintained, and broken. Because the same mechanisms that operated in 18th century France and 20th century China are still operating today in different forms, in different environments, through different technologies. The scale has changed. The speed has changed, but the psychology has not. And once you recognize that, history stops being a sequence of isolated revolutions. It becomes a continuous pattern of human behavior shaped by the constant tension between order and change, stability and freedom, belief and doubt. That is the real structure underneath revolutions, not events, but the mind itself. The deepest misunderstanding about revolutions is that they are events. In reality, revolutions are not events. They are long psychological transitions that reach visible moments of explosion. By the time people notice them, they have already been happening inside the minds of millions for years. And even after they end, they do not disappear. They simply change form and continue operating beneath the surface of society. This is why the French Revolution and the Chinese Revolutionary Transformation cannot be understood as finished stories. They are better understood as case studies of how human psychology behaves under extreme pressure at scale. Modern psychological research on revolutions suggests that, while political systems may change quickly, the underlying behavior of populations changes slowly, meaning most revolutions produce limited deep psychological transformation even when they succeed politically. It means revolutions are not total resets of human nature. They are adjustments within the same human operating system. People expect revolutions to change everything. But what actually changes first is structure, not psychology. And structure always has limits, because structures are built on something deeper, belief. When belief is strong, structures are stable. When belief weakens, structures become vulnerable. When belief collapses, structures disappear. But even then, human emotional needs remain unchanged. This is where the cycle begins again. In both France and China, the initial trigger was not sudden chaos. It was a long accumulation of contradictions between lived reality and perceived legitimacy. In France, society was held together by monarchy, religion, and rigid class structure. For a long time, these systems provided psychological stability. People did not necessarily need to believe they were fair, they only needed to believe they were permanent. But permanence is an illusion. As economic pressure increased, as intellectual ideas spread, and as inequality became more visible, the psychological foundation of legitimacy started to weaken. Once legitimacy weakens, obedience becomes conditional, and conditional obedience is the beginning of systemic instability. At first, this instability is invisible. People continue living normal lives. They continue following rules. But internally, something changes. They begin to interpret authority differently, not as natural, but as constructed. And once authority is seen as constructed, it becomes vulnerable to challenge. This is where Enlightenment thinking played a crucial role in France. It did not directly cause revolution in a mechanical sense. Instead, it changed how people interpreted authority itself. Ideas of equality, rights, and rational governance created a new mental framework in which traditional hierarchy no longer felt inevitable. Wikipedia. This shift is extremely important psychologically because revolutions do not begin when people suffer the most. They begin when people start comparing suffering to alternatives. Comparison creates dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction creates questioning. Questioning creates instability. And instability creates the conditions for collective action. When the French Revolution finally erupted in 1789, it appeared sudden, but it was actually the visible peak of a long, invisible psychological transformation. The storming of the Bastille was not the beginning of disbelief. It was the moment disbelief became collective action. From that moment onward, the system no longer had psychological stability. And once that happens, history accelerates. A similar pattern appears in China, although the structure and context were different. The Qing dynasty represented a long-established imperial system that had maintained authority through tradition, hierarchy, and symbolic legitimacy. But by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, multiple pressures began to destabilize it. Military defeats, internal corruption, foreign influence, and administrative weakness all contributed to a gradual loss of confidence in the system. But again, the most important factor was not external pressure alone. It was psychological perception. When people begin to see their system as weak, outdated, or incapable of protecting them, legitimacy erodes. And when legitimacy erodes, loyalty becomes fragile. The Chinese Revolution of 1911 is best understood not as a single uprising, but as a cascading sequence of regional and political breakdowns that ultimately dissolved imperial authority and replaced it with republican structures. Science direct. But like France, removing the old system did not immediately create stability. Instead, it created fragmentation. And fragmentation is one of the most dangerous psychological conditions in large societies. Because when there is no unified authority, people do not become free in a stable sense. They become uncertain. And uncertainty increases the human need for structure even more strongly than oppression does. This is a critical psychological paradox. People resist control, but they also fear chaos. So when revolutions destroy old systems, they often unintentionally increase demand for new systems of control. This is why revolutionary periods are often followed by the rise of strong, centralized figures. In France, this pattern eventually produced Napoleon Bonaparte, who stabilized post-revolutionary chaos by reorganizing power into a centralized system that restored order and predictability. In China, a similar dynamic later emerged under Mao Zedong, although through a different ideological framework and historical trajectory. In both cases, the key psychological driver was not ideology alone, but the population's need to reduce uncertainty. Once instability reaches a critical threshold, societies begin to prioritize order over ideals. This shift is subtle but decisive. Because it means that the emotional state of the population determines the direction of political evolution more strongly than abstract principles do. Revolutions, therefore, cannot be understood only through leaders, ideologies, or institutions. They must be understood through collective emotional states: fear, hope, anger, exhaustion, and expectation. These emotions are not secondary effects. They are primary forces. They determine whether systems hold or collapse. They determine whether people obey or resist. They determine whether authority is seen as legitimate or illegitimate. And when enough people experience the same emotional shift at the same time, individual psychology becomes collective psychology. At that point, society behaves like a single system. Not because individuals lose rationality, but because shared emotional frameworks synchronize behavior. This synchronization is what produces revolutionary momentum. Once momentum begins, it becomes self-reinforcing. Each act of resistance encourages further resistance. Each breakdown of authority reduces fear. Each successful challenge to power strengthens collective confidence. And once confidence crosses a threshold, reversal becomes extremely difficult. But what makes revolutions psychologically complex is that they do not move in a single direction. They oscillate between order and chaos, between freedom and control, between destruction and reconstruction. This oscillation is not accidental. It is built into the structure of human social organization. Because humans cannot exist in permanent instability, they also cannot exist in permanent rigidity. So societies continuously move between these two poles. Revolutions are simply the extreme expressions of this movement. And this is why they repeat. Not because history is predetermined, but because human psychology is consistent. When legitimacy is strong, systems stabilize. When legitimacy weakens, systems fracture. When systems fracture, societies reorganize. When societies reorganize, new legitimacy forms. And the cycle continues. Understanding this does not remove the emotional power of revolutions, but it does change how you interpret them. You stop seeing them as isolated heroic or tragic moments, and you start seeing them as expressions of a deeper human pattern. A pattern driven not by ideology alone, but by the constant negotiation between belief, emotion, and structure inside large groups of people. That is the real engine behind both the French and Chinese revolutions. And once you see that engine clearly, you are no longer looking at history from the outside. You are looking at the mechanism that shapes it from within.